When I was a small boy at school in Scotland in the 1920s, the early 1920s, and it came to Armistice Day, it was always an incredible emotional experience because there would be 10 or 15 fathers of children in that class who hadn't come back from the war. The other night I'm playing trivia, and the question was, name 3 of the great battles of the First World War, and nobody knew. Who wants to talk about the First World War anyway now, because we know that war of the new style is impossible. But guess who comes up with a book about the First World War? And I don't know why he's written it, really. It's the incredible Burton. And he writes a book about Vimy. Now, where did Vimy stand in the great battles of that disastrous 1914-1918 war?
It was part of the Battle of Arras, and it was the only victory the British had had in 32 months of war. It was fought almost entirely by Canadians, 4 divisions with 1 British brigade. They did what the French couldn't do, they did what the British couldn't do, and they did it very, very quickly with a few casualties. They started off at dawn on Easter Monday, 1917, April the 9th, and by noon, 3 of those divisions were on the crest of the ridge eating their lunch.
How many men had they lost?
They lost 3,000 deaths and 7,000 wounded.
That wasn't the end of the battle, though, was it? That was a new position. How many yards of dirty, rotten mud filled with bodies did the Canadian Corps win?
Oh, about 2 miles. It wasn't the distance, it was the heights. Vimy Ridge was the highest point on the entire Allied line in 400 miles. You could see more of the war from the top of Vimy Ridge than anything else, which gave the Germans an unfettered field of fire against the guys on the other side. It was the toughest bastion. It was a minor Gibraltar, crawling with gun emplacements, riddled with dugouts and tunnels and subways, and with big guns behind, hidden behind the escarpment. And in the Battle of Arras, Vimy was on the left. It was the anchor point. It had to be taken, otherwise the Germans would have commanded the rest of the front. The irony, of course, was it was the only successful part of that battle because the idiot French general had not listened to his intelligence people. He did not know the Germans, except for Vimy Ridge, had pulled back 30 miles, that devastated the ground in a scorched earth policy, and the troops ran over it and had no objectives to take. And by the time they got to the German lines, they were exhausted, and the battle was a failure. But the Battle of Vimy Ridge was not a failure. We took the ridge when nobody else could take it at a very low cost. The French had lost 150,000 men. We lost 10,000 casualties, and we held it for the rest of the war.
Now, when holding that, that's where the incredible giant memorial is to Canadians.
It's on Hill 145, that's right.
Hill 145. Having won that ridge, did it become an important tactical part of the next advance?
I don't think so, really. But then I don't think that any of these advances, and I don't think that any of these battles mattered a good goddamn in World War I. What mattered was that eventually the Allies had more men to slaughter on their side than the Germans had. Because just 2 days before the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the Americans came into the war, providing not only material, but more important, bodies. And I use the word bodies advisedly because a lot of them were really bodies before it was over. World War I was a senseless slaughter. Vimy is important to Canadians because it was the beginning of our status as an independent nation and not a colonial nation. Because of Vimy and because of the Vimy myth. And we're talking about myths aren't necessarily untrue, but we're talking about Vimy as a myth which followed us for 2 or 3 decades in Canada. Canada got rid of its inferiority complex vis-a-vis the British, and the eyes of the world were focused upon it. The Canadian troops became the assault troops in the last 100 days when we pushed through against the Germans. And that led to the Statute of Westminster, in which we ceased to be part of the British Empire and became part of the British Commonwealth.
Pierre, I respect and admire you to the nth degree. Your history books are fantastic, all one of them. But you're not going to tell me that senseless slaughter of 10,000 Canadians led to the Statute of New Westminster and Canada emerging as a nation in its own right.
No, I didn't quite say that. Now, you must listen carefully, Jack.
I'm listening as best I can.
I said that the myth of Vimy, which stood for the effect of the Canadians in World War I, led to the Statute of New Westminster.
How?
Because the Canadians were seen for the first time as a nation able to stand on its own feet and slug toe-to-toe with everybody else. Turned out we were as good as the British and the French troops, and maybe a little better. Mm-hmm. And that changed our attitude towards ourselves, and it changed the attitude of Great Britain and indeed other countries to us. Don't forget that after the war, Canada had a vote at the League of Nations, even though it was part of the British Empire, as did Australia and New Zealand. That was a hard-fought battle, and we got it. And therefore, our status in the international world changed because of World War I, of which Vimy was the crowning achievement. Have you got it now?
I've got it now, but this senseless slaughter, therefore,
of course it
perhaps
was
helped to create the nation of Canada.
Yeah, well, sometimes wars do help create nations.
Create the independent nation of
Create
Canada.
the independent nation. I'm not for senseless slaughter. I think World War I was a silly, stupid, dumb war created by politicians who were too stupid to realize that because of the Industrial Revolution, war was no longer an arm of diplomacy. The machine gun came in, and the machine gun changed warfare for the worse or for the better.
Which brings me to your incredible research. Now, this all comes from, not all comes from, much of it comes from previously unpublished writings of men who survived.
And interviews with them, yeah.
Tell me about them.
Well, my research assistant and I unearthed about 150 veterans of Vimy, and we interviewed about 80. And in addition to the interviews...
They're old men now.
They're in their 90s. And in about half the cases, their minds are as clear and as sharp about Vimy and about World War I as they were when they were young men. The other thing we got was about 25 unpublished manuscripts or letters or documents or diaries, which were very, very useful. Some of these guys sat down and wrote an account for their children, which they squirreled away in attics. And I must tell you, Jack, that some of these accounts are eloquent. They're beautiful writing, even though these guys weren't writers. That experience had seared itself into their mind so much that they were able to talk about it in the most eloquent fashion. And as you know from reading the book, there are a whole series of quotes at the beginning of each chapter.
Most impressive, to say the least. But that trench warfare, and it was trench warfare, 1914 the Germans put through Belgium, almost got to Paris. And then there were these dreadful senseless slaughters at the Somme, Passchendaele.
Well, Ypres first with the gas
Ypres.
attack, then Somme, then Arras, and at the same time Verdun on the French side, and then Passchendaele, which was probably the worst of all. There's a book coming out on that too this year.
Were the tanks used at Vimy Ridge by the Canadians?
There were 8 tanks used, and they were absolutely useless. They didn't know how to use tanks. Nobody knew how to use tanks. They all bogged down in the mud and didn't get anywhere.
Tell me about the machine guns, because, you know, when you were boys and you were reading all these glamorized war stories in the 20s, it was always setting up the Vickers water-cooled machine gun and mowing down the Germans by the score.
Well, it's the Germans who were mowing down the British and the French. There were 2 machine guns, the Vickers water-cooled machine gun and the smaller Lewis gun. They each fired about 500 bullets every minute, and that is what changed modern warfare. The young men that went over to fight at Vimy thought that they were getting it was going to be an adventure. They were going to be dressed in colorful uniforms, and the war would be over by December. They forgot that the Industrial Revolution had caught up with warfare, and the machine gun had changed everything. It meant that you had to burrow like a mole in the ground to get away from that hail of bullets.
How did they dig these trenches? Well, they dug by hand. They had no backhoes in those days.
They dug them all with a pick and a shovel. 8 feet deep, and an absolute cobweb of trenches for 5 miles behind the Vimy lines. Not only trenches, communications trenches 4 miles long, lateral trenches, row after row, protected by barbed wire, but underneath the ground, there were saps and tunnels and subways. There were 13 subways at Vimy. Each of these subways had a railway train running through them, electric light, air conditioning, and it was through these subways, cut by hand in the soft chalk of Arras, that the troops were able to move up to the front without being shot at and killed.
Just appalling. Artillery, of course. The Germans always had bigger and better artillery than the Brits and the French. Am I correct?
In both wars, well, nobody had a better gun than the French 75. The French 75 was the great gun of World War I. But the Germans had better equipment and better guns, generally speaking, in both wars than our side. But we had more men to kill. So the attrition rate, percentage attrition rate among the Germans was a little higher than our side, which is why we won the war. But we won the artillery battle of Vimy, because this was siege warfare. Where's the siege warfare? Don't forget that when the Vimy battle began at dawn and
Hold your breath. We'll take the battle at the start of the details of the battle at the start of the next chapter in Burton's history. Many books have you written on history now?
Oh, I don't know. I've got my name on 32 books, and some of them are anthologies, and some of them are photographic books, but I suppose I've written, I don't know, 15 or 20 history books.
More with Pierre Berton after the break. You know, in the Second World War, and the First and Second, they talked about casualties. That includes killed,
wounded,
missing, and sick.
Yeah.
Guys who had to be removed.
Yeah.
Had the French, we're talking about Pierre Berton's book, Vimy, a bargain at $24.95. Your books don't finish up in coals, do they?
No.
$24.95. the French had already tried to take, how big was Vimy Ridge? How many miles, how many acres, how many whatevers?
Well, it was about 7 miles long, and the Canadian section, which is the section that counted, the high section, was 4 miles. Our front was 4 miles.
And we had one Canadian Corps.
And 4 divisions, 100,000 men, because our divisions were much larger than the French or British divisions, and we kept them reinforced. When we lost men, we broke up the 5th Division to do that. Not only that, but the Canadian divisions, the Canadian Corps is really an army, although they called it a corps. But Vimy was
General
also...
Curry.
General Curry was the 1st divisional commander. General Byng was a Britisher. He was in charge. Not only was it 4 miles long, but I should tell you also it was 450 feet, about 450 feet high, about 500 feet high.
The whole thing.
And it sloped up this way. When we had to go up the slope this way, and then cut off like an escarpment on the other side, where the Germans were, the woods were all on the
But once you got to the top, you'd won the ridge.
No, you had to take the other side too.
You had to go down the other side.
Yeah, but by the time they got to the top, the Germans were running away.
How many days, what would the average age be of these 10,000 Canadian casualties in that
18,
battle?
18 or 19. We forget the World War I was fought by schoolboys, high school boys. The youngest was 15 at Vimy. He enlisted at 13. There's many 16-year-olds at Vimy and many more at 19, 20, 21, 22.
The whole thing was damnable looking back on it.
Yes,
wasn't
it was damnable.
How long did the British or Canadian artillery barrage last before they moved out the trenches?
About 1 minute. It was the famous creeping barrage.
Oh, yeah.
What happened was we had 1,000 guns and 150 machine guns all firing at once. There was a moment of silence, about 5 seconds, and one gun barked and the whole thing opened up. And within about a minute to 3 minutes, the troops went over the top. The barrage moved at the rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes. And the troops are trained, and this is why we won, one of the reasons we won, to stay very close, to hug that barrage, as they said. It blew forward, the shells blew forward to the men, so they didn't shoot back, although many of our men were killed by our own shells.
Oh, sure.
But they had been trained specifically to do that. That had never happened before. At the Somme, it didn't happen. They're so far behind, the Germans popped up after the barrage went over out of their dugout and mowed them down.
This was to get them before the Germans could come up and set up the machine guns.
Exactly.
And it was successful.
Totally successful.
Except for 10,000 casualties.
Well, but that's minor compared to the Somme, where in the first day of the Somme, they lost 50,000. No, 10,000 by World War I standards was peanuts. It was, some of the veterans said it was a piece of cake. We just walked up the ridge. There was no opposition. They'd blasted the wire to pieces. They'd turned the German trenches into mush. They'd ruined the dugouts. The Germans came up shaking like a leaf. I said in the book, as you know, that except for the explosion of Krakatoa in 1883, this was the loudest noise ever heard in the history of warfare. Imagine yourself going forward. Above your head, and not very far above your head, is a screaming canopy of steel, a lot of it red hot, pouring from the guns and landing just in front of you. And you have to move at exactly the same speed as that.
Was this the first time the Canadian Corps had been in a major action?
No, it was the first time they'd been in a major action as a total corps together.
They had been split up among the Brits?
No, they were never split up among the Brits. They weren't allowed, the Canadian government, but really this crazy, insane cabinet minister, Sam Hughes, had the guts to tell Kitchener, you're not going to split our people up. They're Canadians, they're going to fight as Canadians, they're going to think as Canadians, which they did. They'd been at Ypres, they'd fought several battles, they'd been on the Somme, several divisions, but this is the first time, indeed the only time, that the entire Canadian Corps walked ahead, out of the trenches at the same time. From Halifax, Prince Edward Island to Victoria, BC, Canadian Scottish over here, run it, and the Seaforths from here, run it. 20,000 men with their packs on their backs, and a tot of rum stiffening their resolve, and another 10,000 behind them to leapfrog through, as the tactics called, and behind them, 70,000 support troops, artillery, service corps, ordnance corps, runners, medical corps, stretcher bearers, every kind of cooks, everybody.
Fearsome. Yeah. Well, at least we'll never have that kind of battle again, will we? I mean, Vietnam was money for old rope compared to that kind of slaughter on the field, wasn't it?
This was warfare at its most uncomfortable.
You mentioned Sam Hughes. Now, you said that crazy Canadian cabinet minister, Sam Hughes. Tell people about Sam Hughes.
Sam Hughes
He was defense minister.
He was the minister of militia. And he was, in my opinion, and the opinion of the prime minister, who later said this, and several others.
Which prime minister?
It was Borden, Robert Borden. He was certifiably insane. He was a kook. He was a nut. He thought people should form squares and things like that. He thought he should have been given 2 VCs for his part in the Boer War, and he used to plague the Governor General, to everybody's embarrassment, demanding these 2 Victoria Crosses. But the one thing he did is he went over to see that awesome figure, Kitchener, and say, we will not be broken up. our men will fight together as one unit. And because they did, of course, they got a sense of community. You were asking at the beginning, what was the purpose? Well, this was the purpose, to give people the feeling they were Canadians. Frank Worthington, whose son Peter you know,
Yes, yes.
and who became a general in the Second World War, fighting Frank, was only 3 days in Canada before he joined up. He's British. He said, I thought of myself as British till the day of Vimy Ridge. When I stood on the top of the ridge, I knew I was a Canadian.
Oh, that's very well said. I see Victor Odlum, one of our famous family. Was he one of the generals in that?
He was a brigadier general. He invented the trench raid, or is credited with inventing the trench raid. I think more than one did that. He had a very bad time at Vimy because the 4th Division was up against Hill 145, where the Germans had hidden machine guns that nobody knew about. And that was he was in the longest of the fight. And that fight went on for 2 or 3 days. The rest of the battle was over by dusk on the same day.
There's one very intriguing little bit in your book which might bring back relationships to another war, a later war. Were there any Japanese Canadians from British Columbia fighting in the First World War at Vimy Ridge?
There were indeed, and they fought harder, and perhaps because they had something to prove. The Japanese Canadians were known as the toughest fighters on the Western Front, and they were honored by the people that fought. There were a lot of them in the 50th Battalion from Calgary. Victor Wheeler, who wrote a book about the 50th Battalion, saw several of them. He tells of one man who had his father's samurai sword and went over the top and was finally killed. These are the same guys or whose children, you know, we treated so badly in this town in World War II.
Well, you were here then.
I was here then, and I must say that on my paper, we opposed the movement of the Japanese. It was the Little News Herald. The bigoted paper was the Vancouver Sun. I never let them forget that.
And remind them again.
Yeah, they did. They were bigoted in their editorials. They thought the Japanese were...
What about this? That's great. I hope everybody buys Pierre Berton's Vimy book. And a lot of the old survivors in this town.
Yes, we had a party the other night for 8 of them came to the party, 2 of whom are in this book, and the stories about them in this book. They had a wonderful time.
What about this man, Berton? How old are you now?
What man is that? Oh,
that's you. How old are you now, Pierre?
I'm 66.
You're not really, are you?
Yeah, I'm 66. I get the old age pension for what it's worth and give it back to the government every April.
Do you dye your hair?
No.
I mean, what's left of it?
I don't even bleach it.
That is a natural white color.
It's natural. It has been for some time.
Are you a fisherman, an angler on the west coast of some note?
Yes. As you well know, you saw me haul the first fish in this year on Hal Straight's boat off Seashelt. The CBC cameras grinding.
Is it not a fact that you were responsible for Mr. Strait getting flustered and almost wrecking his boat on the rocks?
I don't think I was responsible. That certainly happened. You were there too, so you got to take half the blame, Jack.
Best of luck, Pierre.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Saying the best of luck to you is like wishing the Pope holiness.
You never know. You never know.
My thanks to Pierre Berton. He's always a great standby interview. Never ever let you down, does dear old Pierre Berton. I'll be back after the break.